Hey, a book jumped off my shelf the other day. I was in my office and I just got my attention drawn to the words on the spine of that book right there, The Emotionally Healthy Church. And I pulled it off the shelf, sat down, and I spent quite a bit of time, one of the afternoons of this week, just looking through that, the table of contents, and thinking to myself, well, Church of the Cross, it's one of the most emotionally healthy churches that I've ever been a part of. Why am I looking at this? What would we have here that we could benefit from? And I kind of began to think, yeah, it's the times that we're in. And just a deeper probe into what life is like for you and for me, for Beth and I. And kind of how we have found ourselves this journey with Christ, with God. In some ways, it's kind of been, there's this side route of just coping with pandemic, coping with all of the noise, the political season that we're in, what have you. The ways that stuff just kind of gets in us and actually hooks into, well, some emotional stuff, deeper stuff. And I have a question that kind of, as I was reading, formulated or clarified itself in my mind is, does church make us better people? Does the church make you a better person? And as I reflected on that, I started to think, your and my spiritual health doesn't outpace our emotional health. Let me say that again. Your spiritual health will not outpace your emotional health. Our emotions, they're a gift from God. And we use them to help us to navigate our way through life's challenges, in crises. They're kind of one of those tools, resources in our personalities. They're shaped and placed into our beings from the very early part of our lives. We've all seen the image of an iceberg. And maybe you've been in a workshop where that's a metaphor that was used to kind of describe the stuff above the surface is actually, large though it may look, it's dwarfed by all of that which is below the surface, below the sight line. And that's a pretty good image, I think, of our emotional life, of maybe other things that are unconscious or barely conscious, of memories, of voices, of trauma, of wonderful images of maybe Christmas mornings of long ago that we, for the rest of our lives, are trying to replicate and never quite reaching. So there's all that stuff, and you and I, we see one another. And yet, we also understand that there are things, probably many things below the surface. We respect that in one another. But seeking to grow together, to appear and actually become more and more like Christ, it's good to see in our scriptures, Jesus too has emotions, that he grieves the loss of loved ones, that he gets frustrated with his followers, his disciples, that he gets angry over the traditions that have evolved around the temple and around people's faith and relationship with God. He has these deep emotions, and yet fully human, fully God. He wants so much to be along in our journey as we become deeper and more healthy, spiritual and emotional people. We've all encountered someone who grew up maybe with an abusive parent and then observed that person marrying an abusive spouse, or we see someone who we've watched a girl dating horrible guys over and over, or a guy dating just the wrong girl for him over and over. We've seen folks with such ambition and then respecting it at first, admiring it maybe even, and then kind of coming to the conclusion, who is this person trying to impress? You have to ask yourself, what does Jesus want to help us to see and learn about ourselves, about our hearts? In Proverbs, there's this one verse, above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. How are you and I supposed to guard our heart when our hearts have been damaged? When you've been hurt? You know, it requires an honest and truthful examination, reflection. Jesus says as well in chapter 8 of the Gospel of John, if you hold to my teaching, if you get your mind around my teachings, you'll really be my disciples. And then you will know the truth. And then there's this phrase, and the truth will set you free. You and I, as we are together, and as we are in the world, we've got to become unmasked. We'll say again, saints, you saints, I called you that last week, you and I, we need to become unmasked. Not to scare one another, but to be in the Spirit of Christ as the body of Christ, growing and seeking to become more like Him. In pressure situations, even our well-managed lives, we reveal some of this stuff underneath the surface, some of this raw stuff. So the conversation that we need to have, if we seek to grow spiritually closer to God, if we seek to resemble more and more as the followers of Jesus, is what is really true about ourselves. How do I get vulnerable? How do I become, in some settings, in some relatively safe settings, really honest? How do I do that work? Let's come back in a moment and just explore a little bit how God's love and grace and presence and goodness can help us with this work.